A powerful judge thought he was untouchable until he humiliated the wrong woman. When Judge Edward Chun mocked Pam Bondi in court, the room went silent, but not for long. Hidden recordings, a hot mic, and a federal investigation flipped the courtroom upside down. By the end of the hearing, it wasn't Pam in trouble. It was the judge in handcuffs. And trust me, you'll want to stay till the very end to see how justice was served in the most unexpected way. It started like any other court hearing, until it didn't. The courtroom was quiet, tense with anticipation. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. Court staff moved briskly, attorneys whispered final notes to their clients, and the hum of a high-profile trial buzzed just beneath the surface. At the center of it all was Judge Edward Chun, a man feared as much as he was respected. Stern, sharp-tongued, and known for his intolerance of what he deemed wasted words. He was the kind of judge who demanded silence before he even entered the room. He carried himself like a king cloaked in black robes, ruling from the bench like it was his throne. This morning, he seemed even more severe than usual, scanning the room with a cold, calculating gaze. His reputation preceded him. Chun had a history of dressing down lawyers in front of full courtrooms, especially ones he believed relied too much on their reputation. Some called it discipline. Others called it ego. And then Pam Bondi walked in. The former Florida Attorney General, known nationally for her sharp mind, firm voice, and unshakable poise, entered with quiet confidence. She was part of a powerhouse legal team representing a whistleblower in a billion-dollar federal corruption case, one that had already drawn media attention and political scrutiny. As she approached the bench to present opening remarks, all eyes turned to her, Chen's included. But his expression wasn't respectful, it was dismissive, disdainful even. Bondi stood tall, cleared her throat, and began laying out the foundation of their argument with clarity and control. She referenced statutes, cited precedents, and spoke with a measured pace, ensuring every word was heard. But she had barely made it through her second paragraph when Judge Chun leaned forward and cut her off. "Ms. Bondi," he said, waving his hand, "please spare us the textbook lecture. You're not arguing in a classroom." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Bondi blinked but didn't react. "I was simply laying the legal groundwork for the court, Your Honor," she said calmly. Chun leaned back with a smirk. "Yes, I'm aware of what you were trying to do. But let's not pretend this is groundbreaking. Your argument is embarrassingly naive." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A few attorneys exchanged shocked glances. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Bondi, however, didn't flinch. She adjusted her papers slowly, then looked Judge Chun squarely in the eye. "Is this how justice is served in your courtroom, Your Honor?" Silence. The room froze. Even the stenographer hesitated for a beat before resuming her rapid keystrokes. The tension was now thick enough to cut. Chun stiffened, clearly not expecting a response with such calm defiance. But Bondi wasn't done. She continued her remarks, unshaken, her voice steady and clear. And although Judge Chun interrupted her 2 more times, each time with thinly veiled contempt, she never once lost her composure. Instead, her legal argument grew stronger, more pointed, and more direct. She laid out facts with surgical precision. And in doing so, she exposed something deeper, the imbalance of power at play in that room. Unbeknownst to Judge Chun, the entire exchange had been picked up on a hot mic he'd forgotten to mute during a brief sidebar earlier. Even more damning, a side comment he'd made during that break had also been captured, an offhand, mocking remark about blonde ambition and TV lawyers trying to play with the big boys. Within minutes, whispers started swirling through the back of the courtroom. A court clerk who'd long suspected misconduct from the judge quietly passed the audio recording to federal monitors. What started as a disrespectful exchange had just escalated into possible judicial misconduct. And still, Bondi stayed professional, never raising her voice, never stooping to insult. She knew the power of presence. She knew how to let the system expose itself. When the session ended and Judge Chun declared recess, most thought it would continue like any other day. But just as he stood to leave the bench, 2 federal marshals entered the courtroom. They weren't there to watch. They were there for him. What Judge Edward Chun didn't know was that someone in the courtroom had been quietly recording him for weeks. Courtroom 4B had always felt more like a stage than a place of justice under Chin's authority. Lawyers whispered about his favoritism, his icy temper, and his growing habit of mocking attorneys who challenged him. But no one had ever dared confront him, until today. And now, everything was unraveling faster than anyone could have imagined. That morning, when Chin openly insulted Pam Bondi in front of a stunned courtroom, he had no idea that he was already being watched, not just by spectators, but by a junior court officer who had seen enough over the past year to be concerned. Quietly, she had started recording snippets of behavior she believed crossed ethical lines. Unofficial at first. Just insurance. Just in case. But today was different. Today, the judge had forgotten something critical, his hot mic. During a short recess after Bondi's statement, Chin retreated to his chambers and didn't realize his wireless microphone, still clipped to his robe, was actively broadcasting through a secondary courtroom feed. What came next wasn't just improper, it was damning. As clerks and legal assistants moved about their tasks, one of the monitors in the side hallway remained on. The room was quiet, but Chin's voice came through clearly, as if he were speaking right next to them. "I don't care who she is," Chin muttered to an unseen colleague. "Pam Bondi walks in here thinking she's someone special? Please, blonde ambition doesn't impress me. She's just another political face with no real backbone." There was a pause, a dry chuckle, then more. "I might just let her hang herself in front of everyone. Sometimes it's fun watching them squirm." One of the assistants froze. Another looked up in disbelief. This wasn't the usual behind-closed-doors banter. This was active prejudice, recorded and time-stamped, heard by more than one person, and broadcast through the court's own system. And the worst part? It wasn't the only recording. Earlier in the hearing, a member of the public sitting in the back row had also been filming on a concealed body camera, one of several investigative tools quietly authorized by an internal whistleblower unit. The clip captured Chun interrupting Bondi mid-sentence, laughing to himself, and making dismissive faces as she spoke. Clear bias, captured in real time. That footage, along with the audio from the hot mic, was immediately packaged by a clerk who had long suspected misconduct but had lacked the evidence to act. She didn't hesitate this time. First, she emailed the files directly to the Judicial Oversight Committee. Then she followed protocol and sent a confidential alert to the U.S. Marshals Service, which maintains authority to intervene when judicial integrity is at stake. What began as a tense moment in court had just escalated into a full-blown federal review in real time. Meanwhile, Judge Chin carried on, unaware that he'd just stepped into his own trap. He returned from recess, adjusted his robe, and prepared to continue the hearing, likely thinking his earlier remarks had been swept aside. But the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Attorneys whispered more urgently. A few glanced toward the rear exit. Two court officers, normally stationed at the far corners, had moved slightly closer to the bench. Pam Bondi, though perfectly composed, was now joined by a federal observer from the Department of Justice who had slipped into the back row unnoticed. And yet, Chin remained confident, arrogant, even. He began speaking again, but there was a new tension in his voice. It was almost as if, somewhere deep down, he sensed the air had changed but didn't yet understand why. Unbeknownst to him, the digital trail of his own words and actions had already reached the inboxes of multiple federal offices. The Judicial Conduct Review Board had been notified. A rapid response team with the marshals was already on standby 2 floors below. The courthouse had quietly locked down key exits as protocol required when a sitting judge faces immediate investigation. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was the authority in the room. But now, the law was turning on him. Pam Bondi remained composed throughout the hearing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes or fire back with emotion. Instead, she did what true professionals do when the pressure mounts. She let her knowledge, poise, and preparation do the talking. Judge Edward Chun continued his condescending interruptions, but Bondi never flinched. Every time he tried to cut her off, she redirected with precision. When he attempted to discredit her arguments, she calmly responded, not just with counterpoints, but with constitutional precedents. She cited Marshall versus Jericho to highlight the necessity of judicial impartiality. She invoked Caperton v. A.T. Massey Coal Company, emphasizing the importance of recusal in cases where bias, even the perception of it, could taint proceedings. She referenced Title VII and the 14th Amendment, pointing to the judge's unequal treatment of attorneys based on gender. The courtroom shifted. Even those who had initially dismissed the exchange as courtroom ego now leaned forward, listening closely. Bondi wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was building a case against the bench itself. And then came the bombshell. With the same calm, unwavering tone she had held all morning, Bondi reached into her briefcase and pulled out a file. "Your Honor," she said, meeting Judge Chen's eyes, "I respectfully request this be entered into the court record." She handed it to the clerk, who opened the folder hesitantly. Inside was a formal judicial misconduct complaint, already signed and dated, with a supporting statement from Bondi. But that wasn't all. Attached were 7 sworn affidavits, each from different attorneys, both male and female, detailing past incidents where Judge Chen had displayed patterns of gender bias, verbal hostility, and abusive courtroom behavior. The signatures included 2 former federal prosecutors and a retired appellate attorney. The room went dead silent. "This isn't just about me," Bondi said, turning slightly to face the room, her voice now rising just enough to be heard by all. "This is about every voice that's been silenced in this courtroom. Every young female lawyer told to sit down. Every legal mind dismissed before finishing a sentence. And every case that may have been influenced, not by the law, but by a personal bias no one dared challenge." Her words hit like a tidal wave. A collective breath seemed to pass through the courtroom. People weren't just watching a legal battle anymore. They were watching a historic confrontation unfold. And that's when it happened. At that exact moment, 2 federal marshals quietly entered the courtroom. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't make a scene. They moved with calm authority, dressed in plain suits, their badges only visible when they pulled back their jackets. One stood by the side entrance. The other made his way along the side aisle and stopped just behind the bench. Judge Chen noticed. His eyes darted toward them for only a second, but it was enough. His voice faltered slightly as he tried to resume the hearing. "Let the record reflect," he began, but the words caught in his throat. Pam Bondi said nothing. She simply stepped back, folded her hands, and waited. The marshal behind the bench leaned in and whispered something. Chen froze. His hands, once confidently placed atop his gavel, now twitched as he reached for a glass of water. The courtroom remained utterly still. Then the second marshal stepped forward, producing a sealed envelope. "Judge Edward Chen," he said clearly, "you are being served with an immediate suspension order pending federal investigation into judicial misconduct. You are requested to step down from the bench and accompany us voluntarily." Gasps erupted from the gallery. The court clerk looked stunned. The bailiff took a single step toward the bench, unsure what to do. Judge Chen sat still for a moment, blinking as if trying to decide whether this was real. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he rose from his seat. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but found nothing to say. The same arrogance he had carried into that courtroom now melted into disbelief. As the marshals escorted him out, the only sound was the steady shuffle of their footsteps and the quiet clicking of cameras from observers who could barely believe what they were witnessing. Pam Bondi didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once, then turned back to her team. Justice hadn't just been argued that day. It had walked into the room and walked out with the judge in custody. As Judge Edward Chen slammed his gavel and barked, "This hearing is adjourned," the sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a final warning. But before the court reporter could even finish typing the last word, 2 federal marshals stepped forward. They moved with deliberate authority, no rush, no hesitation. One of them, a tall man with a firm jaw and a calm stare, stepped beside the bench and spoke in a voice that silenced even the whispering crowd. "Judge Edward Chen," he said, his voice steady and clear, "you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and abuse of authority under federal statute." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Gasps filled the air. Phones lit up instantly. Audience members who had come to witness a corruption case were now live-streaming the fall of a federal judge. Reporters seated in the press row scrambled to grab their cameras. Some in the gallery rose to their feet in stunned disbelief. unsure whether they were watching a dramatic protest or a federal takedown. His gavel fell from his hand and rolled off the bench, hitting the ground with a hollow thunk. The authority he had clung to for years had vanished in an instant. You can't do this," Chin stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm a federal judge. I have immunity. This is outrageous." But the marshals didn't flinch. "You're not above the law," the second marshal replied calmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." A pair of steel handcuffs emerged from the marshal's belt. The clicking of the metal echoed like a drumbeat in the now-hushed chamber. Judge Chin backed away instinctively, but there was nowhere to run. His courtroom, once a fortress of control, had become a stage for accountability. His back hit the edge of the bench as one marshal gently turned him around. The other took his arms and secured the cuffs behind his back. The visual was surreal. The black robe he had worn like armor for over a decade now hung crooked, caught on his shoulders, trailing behind him like a fallen crown. The once proud figure who had belittled lawyers and barked orders was now reduced to silence, eyes darting, mouth half open, fingers twitching against cold steel. Gasps turned to murmurs. Some people began to clap. In the back of the room, a young female attorney, one who had once left this very courtroom in tears after being scolded by Chun, covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling in her eyes. Beside her, her mentor simply nodded, whispering, "About damn time." Pam Bondi stood quietly near her desk, arms crossed. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. Justice wasn't always loud, she had once said. Sometimes it walked slowly. Sometimes it waited. But eventually, it came. And today, it had arrived wearing a badge and carrying handcuffs. As Chun was led down the center aisle, dozens of eyes followed him. His head was lowered now, no longer scanning the room with superiority, but instead locked in a daze. His shoes scraped softly against the marble floor. From behind, someone muttered, "The robe doesn't protect you anymore." Outside the courthouse, sirens wailed in the distance. News vans were already gathering. A sea of reporters had started forming by the entrance, tipped off minutes earlier by internal leaks. They didn't know why they were there yet, but they would soon. Inside, as the marshals exited with Chun between them, the heavy oak doors slowly creaked shut behind them. The sound was final. And then silence. The courtroom sat in stunned stillness. After several seconds, the clerk cleared her throat and turned to Bondi. "Ms. Bondi, do you wish to proceed?" Pam took a breath. "We'll need a new judge," she said quietly. "But yes, we proceed." Because this case wasn't just about one man's downfall. It was about restoring integrity to the very institution he had tried to twist for his own ego. Justice had been delayed in this courtroom for far too long. But on this day, it had finally been served to the one man who believed he ruled above it. And the gavel would never sound the same again. The arrest of Judge Edward Chin sent shockwaves rippling across the nation. By nightfall, the footage had gone viral. News anchors scrambled to cover the unfolding scandal. Legal experts weighed in live on air, and hashtags like #JudgeTheJudge and #JusticeForAll began trending across every major social media platform. People didn't just see a judge in handcuffs. They saw the very symbol of unchecked power finally being held accountable. Every major network led with the story, "Federal judge arrested during hearing after mocking Pam Bondi, caught on hot mic." For the first time in years, courtroom misconduct, often whispered about, rarely punished, was in the national spotlight. It wasn't just news. It was a reckoning. Outside the courthouse, under a flood of flashing cameras and microphones, Pam Bondi stood before the press. She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. Wearing a calm expression and standing tall, she delivered a short but powerful statement that would be replayed for days. "No one is above the law, not even the ones who wear the robe," she said. "Today wasn't about me. It was about restoring trust in the system and holding those accountable who think they're too powerful to fall." Then, with a nod, she turned and walked away, refusing to bask in the media frenzy. She had made her point, and the world had heard it loud and clear. Within 48 hours, the Judicial Oversight Committee launched a full-scale investigation into Judge Chin's conduct. The evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, hot mic audio, sworn affidavits, and even internal complaints that had been previously ignored. But the true floodgate opened when former attorneys, clerks, and litigants began stepping forward. Emails poured in. Phone calls jammed the oversight hotline. Story after story painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had long ruled his courtroom through intimidation, bias, and unchecked arrogance. Some described being humiliated in front of clients. Others claimed he had derailed careers with offhand comments. Several female attorneys admitted they had stopped accepting cases in his court altogether just to avoid the verbal abuse. One former public defender wrote anonymously, "For years, I told myself to keep my head down, stay quiet, and survive his court. I thought speaking up would destroy my career. But now, seeing Pam Bondi stand up like that, she gave us all our voice back." By the end of the week, the consequences came swiftly. Judge Edward Chun was officially stripped of his title by emergency order. His access to court files, chambers, and staff was immediately revoked. He was placed under federal supervision while the Department of Justice moved forward with formal charges: obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and violations of the Judicial Code of Conduct. He now faced not just public disgrace, but potential prison time. But amid the national headlines and political noise, something deeper was happening too. Law schools across the country used the case as a live example in ethics classes. Judicial watchdog groups reported a surge in complaints and tips, many from people who said they now had the courage to speak out. And at the heart of it all was Pam Bondi. She didn't ask for the spotlight. She had come to court that day to represent a whistleblower in a corruption case. Ironically, one that had nothing to do with the judge himself. But when confronted with abuse and disrespect, she hadn't backed down. She hadn't yelled or stormed out. She had done what the robe demanded: uphold the law, even when it meant holding the bench accountable. Her actions reminded the country that real strength isn't in volume. It's in composure. It's in knowing the law and using it with precision. And it's in standing up, not just for yourself, but for everyone else who couldn't. In the days that followed, Bondi continued with the original case she came to court for, now under a new, neutral judge. But everywhere she went, people greeted her not just as an attorney, but as a symbol of courage and integrity. She hadn't just won a case. She had helped expose a flaw in the very system that was meant to protect justice. And through it all, she never lost control, never lost grace. She proved that sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that doesn't need to shout. Because true justice doesn't scream for attention, it stands quietly and acts when it matters most. And on that day, in that courtroom, it finally did. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, sparked something inside you, or made you believe in real justice again, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal truth, courage, and accountability. Stay tuned. The next one might be even bigger. See you in the next video.